He looked strange and even a bit ridiculous, but he was feared more than many heavy bombers. Soldiers knew that if he hovered in the sky, shells and bombs would soon rain down. Pilots recalled how this slow-moving scout endured bursts of cannon fire and still returned to base. The Rama could evade an attack with the most unexpected maneuver, disappear in a hedge-hopping flight, and even return home with punctured tanks or a missing wing. Near Stalingrad, its appearance over Mamayev Kurgan caused panic among the fighters. They knew that a new wave of attacks would inevitably follow. Why did such a seemingly fragile machine become a legend, and how did it manage to leave its mark on the memory of soldiers on both sides? What lay behind its unique design? And why is it still called one of the most resilient aircraft of World War II? Most importantly, how did this Rama turn into a symbol of the war, even though only a few hundred were built? The answers are in this story, where behind every sortie lies drama, fear, and stubborn resilience. From the first days of the war, soldiers of the Red Army heard a distinct sound, impossible to confuse with anything else. It came from above, seemed to hang over the trenches, circled slowly, and instilled unease. This sound belonged to an aircraft that soldiers quickly nicknamed the Rama, frame, due to its characteristic appearance. Its arrival almost always meant that an artillery barrage or a bomber attack would soon follow. For infantrymen, it became a harbinger of disaster, and for pilots, a real challenge, as shooting it down was far more difficult than it seemed at first glance. The Ramas seemed to deliberately flaunt their presence. They hovered over the front line, circled positions for hours, and appeared to be the all-seeing eyes of the German army. Each of their sorties had a specific purpose: reconnaissance, fire correction, detection of movement. And it was precisely this constancy, this almost intrusive presence, that made them a symbol of the wartime sky. For the soldiers, they embodied German tenacity and technical ingenuity, which had to be reckoned with. Pilots, on the other hand, described the Rama as an enemy that never gave up easily. Despite its modest size, this aircraft was extraordinarily resilient. It could withstand numerous hits from small arms fire and continue to stay airborne. Its maneuverability allowed it to evade attacks, and the wide glazing of the cockpit made its crew sharp-eyed and ready for any turn of events. It seemed as if the Rama knew every contour of the battlefield and could use it to its advantage. For Soviet pilots, a victory over this scout became not only a military objective, but also a symbolic triumph. Shooting down a Rama meant blinding the enemy, depriving them of the ability to prepare attacks in advance. But this is precisely why battles with it were always intense and required decisiveness. Generals later recalled how these machines could appear over key sections of the front again and again, and each time their arrival meant new troubles. Thus, step by step, an aircraft built in relatively small numbers became a legend. Even ordinary soldiers who rarely paid attention to aircraft makes knew it by sight. But it was the Rama that became the symbol of German reconnaissance on the Eastern Front, persistent, dangerous, and almost elusive. In 1937, the German Air Ministry formulated new requirements for an Army reconnaissance aircraft. The Army needed a 3-seat aircraft that would provide all-around visibility and could replace the outdated Fiesler Phi 156 Storch. The requirements sounded ambitious. The machine had to be maneuverable, possess good stability at low altitudes, and allow the crew to see everything happening on the ground below its wings. German design firms responded quickly. Among the submitted projects was the unusual asymmetrical Blohm and Voss BV-141, the Arado R-198, and a project by Focke-Wulf, which received the index FW-189. Each of these aircraft had its peculiarities, but the Focke-Wulf project immediately stood out. Its central gondola was almost entirely glazed, providing the crew with unprecedented visibility. Its 2 engines and original tail assembly on twin booms gave the design stability and a recognizable appearance. Air Ministry officials initially leaned towards the Arado, considering the other machines too unusual and complex, but tests showed that the Arado had serious drawbacks: poor handling and low flight performance. At the same time, the advantages of the FW-189 became evident with each new flight. Its visibility exceeded all expectations, and the design's capabilities allowed for various applications, from direct support of ground troops to a training aircraft, an armored assault plane, or even a transport for light cargo. The nicknames given to this machine themselves reflected its uniqueness. For its glazed cockpit, the aircraft was called the Uhu, eagle owl, sometimes the Uul, owl, and in the press it was known as the flying eye. This was not just a comparison. Indeed, the crew could see almost everything happening on the ground below them, and it was this quality that soon turned the FW-19 into an important instrument of future warfare. When designers Kurt Tank and Ernst Udet took on the project of the new Scout, they immediately understood that standard solutions would not yield the desired result. They needed to create a machine that could see the battlefield better than any other. Thus came the idea of a large glazed gondola cockpit, which seemed to turn the aircraft into a hovering observation post. Almost all the space in front of the crew was occupied by flat panels of transparent triplex glass, creating a panoramic view inaccessible to pilots of other machines. The design with two tail booms connected by a stabilizer was also unusual. This solution provided stability while leaving the central part of the fuselage entirely for the cockpit and equipment. This configuration became the FW-1's calling card and made it recognizable even from a great distance. In the summer of 1938, the first prototype took to the air. Kurt Tank personally participated in the test flights and was pleased with the machine's performance. Despite its seemingly fragile appearance, the aircraft behaved confidently, responded obediently to control, and showed good results at low speeds. It was then that its nicknames were established. In the troops, it was called the Uhu. The designer himself preferred the word Uul, and journalists eagerly wrote about the flying eye. All these names emphasize the same thing. The aircraft was designed for observation, for noticing the smallest details on the ground, and directing airstrikes with surgical precision. Tests confirmed that the concept chosen was correct. The extensive glazing indeed provided unparalleled visibility, and the unconventional aerodynamic design made the aircraft stable and maneuverable. From that moment on, the FW-189 ceased to be merely a bold idea and became a real instrument of future warfare. After the first successful flights, it became clear that the project could not be left at the experimental stage. But the path from prototype to series production turned out to be much longer and more complex than the designers had anticipated. The first FW-189 V-13 was essentially a pure reconnaissance aircraft, light, maneuverable, and with minimal armament. It took off confidently, showed excellent stability at low altitudes, and was easily controlled even in strong crosswinds. The next prototype, the FW-189 V2, received more serious armament. Its design included MG-17 machine guns mounted in the wing roots, and one MG-15 machine gun each in the nose and middle sections of the gondola, as well as in the tail cone. This configuration allowed the crew to cover several directions simultaneously and, if necessary, engage ground targets. Light bombs weighing up to 50 kilometers, as well as special aviation equipment, including chemical ones, could be suspended from the wing pylons. This made the aircraft not just an observer, but also a light attack plane capable of engaging in combat. By the end of 1939, the company had enough data to offer the military the final version, the FW-189A. The machine looked promising, however. The Luftwaffe leadership was in no hurry to make a decision. At that time, the troops were still using the Fi-156, and it seemed to be fulfilling its duties. This is why the fate of the new aircraft was uncertain for a long time. The designers continued to work on improvements, proposing new variants, and only a few years later did it become clear that the old technology was hopelessly outdated, and the FW-19 could provide the Army with what it lacked before: eyes that see everything. When the first batches of the FW-189A0 series were ready, the aircraft finally began to prove its worth in real-world operation. Pilots noted the comfort of the cockpit, the excellent visibility, and the fact that the aircraft remained controllable even with one engine running. But for a long time, the Luftwaffe continued to delay mass orders, relying on the old Fi-156s. These aircraft could still perform reconnaissance tasks at the beginning of the war, but it soon became obvious that their capabilities were catastrophically insufficient. Experience on the Western Front showed that the HS-126 was no longer adequate for the demands of modern warfare. The vast distances, the high density of equipment on the front, and the rapid pace of combat required a fundamentally different level of reconnaissance. It was then that the Rama got its chance. The command gave the go-ahead for pre-production A0 machines, and then for the full production of the A1 variant. Production proved to be a task no less complex than the tests themselves. The main production facilities of the Focke-Wulf plant were overloaded with the production of the FW-190 fighter, leaving little room for the new aircraft. Then allies were brought in. The Czech Aero plant had already assembled over 150 FW-100A9s by 1941, while the parent plant had managed to produce less than 100. Soon, French facilities were also involved. Production tooling was moved from Bremen to Marignac, and production was established there so quickly that 24 new reconnaissance aircraft rolled off the assembly line each month. Thus, the shortage of FE-156s and the growing demand for a modern reconnaissance aircraft effectively paved the way for the Rama. Gradually, the aircraft became a familiar part of frontline aviation, and its characteristic silhouette appeared more and more often over the front line. With the spread of the first series, it became clear that the machine needed further refinement. Combat experience showed that, despite all its maneuverability and stability, the Rama was still vulnerable to rear attacks. The answer to this was the appearance of the FW-189B version. In it, the old MG-15 machine guns were replaced by a twin MG-81Z, which could fire up to 3,600 rounds per minute. The installation received electric drive, which significantly facilitated aiming and allowed for more reliable coverage of the rear hemisphere. The most unusual element of the aircraft remained its central gondola. It was made as a single unit with the wing center section and attached by rivets to the spars. It housed the crew, equipment, and part of the armament. The pilot's seat was shifted to the left, and almost all instruments were also located on this side. To the right and slightly behind, on a rotating seat, sat the radio operator navigator, who was responsible for the bomb sight and communications, and could fire from the upper turret if necessary. In the tail section, on a mattress, lay the flight engineer gunner, covering the rear sector. This arrangement allowed the crew to work cohesively and quickly, exchange information without special communication devices. The nose of the gondola was almost entirely glazed, turning it into a real observation post. In front of the crew were aerial cameras and handheld movie cameras, allowing them to record troop movements and positions for subsequent strikes. The cabin could also be heated, which significantly facilitated long sorties in winter conditions. The aircraft's armament included 5 7.92mm machine guns. The main firing points covered the rear hemisphere, and the front machine guns were most often used for firing at ground targets. Wing pylons were equipped for light bombs, which could be dropped from both a dive and level flight. Despite the relatively small load, this allowed the aircraft to also perform the functions of a light attack plane. A special advantage of the FW-189 was its aerodynamics. The aircraft could perform turns at speeds around 200 km/h and evade attacks by descending in a spiral and switching to hedge-hopping flight. This made it a difficult target even for experienced fighters. All this made the Rama not just a reconnaissance aircraft, but a versatile battlefield tool combining observation, defense, and the ability to actively intervene in combat. When the first downed FW-189s landed on Soviet territory, they were meticulously studied by specialists from the Research Institute of the Air Force. A captured A2 version was given to engineers and test pilots, and it was then that much of what had previously seemed a mystery was revealed. First and foremost, attention was drawn to the power plant. The two Argus S410 engines were reliable and simple. They started easily even in severe frost and did not fail in flight. The design provided for quick replacement of the power plant, along with the engines and cowlings, which significantly simplified repairs. 2 fuel tanks, each holding 222 liters, were protected, meaning they had puncture resistance. This increased the aircraft's chances of continuing its flight, even after being hit. The two-spar wing design, with stressed skin, which gave the aircraft strength and endurance, aroused particular interest. But the main object of attention, of course, was the central gondola. It gave the impression of being meticulously thought out. The pilot and navigator were located close to each other, could exchange remarks without communication devices, and the gunner had enough space to act effectively. Despite the simplicity, such crew placement ensured excellent interaction in combat. However, weaknesses were also discovered. The cockpit's armor protection was minimal, making the crew vulnerable to frontal attacks. The small arms armament, although it covered the rear hemisphere, lacked sufficient power to withstand the onslaught of Soviet fighters if they attacked decisively and skillfully. Dive attacks at an angle of 30 to 45 degrees, or attacks from below at a large angle, were considered particularly dangerous. Nevertheless, the testers acknowledged the Rama as a unique machine. Its maneuverability at low speeds was astonishing. The aircraft could perform turns where fighters risked stalling. Its survivability also proved surprisingly high. Even with punctured tanks or a damaged engine, the FW-19 maintained controllability and could return to the airfield. The assessments of Soviet specialists were tinged with respect. The design with 2 tail booms and an extensive cockpit was one of the most successful for reconnaissance and artillery fire correction. But despite all its advantages, the Rama remained vulnerable to decisive attacks, and this gave hope that Soviet pilots always had a chance to gain the upper hand over this persistent flying eye. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, Ramas first appeared over the Soviet-German front line. Their recognizable silhouette and the drawn-out sound of their engines quickly became an object of hatred for soldiers. Infantrymen knew that if this strange twin-boom aircraft circled over their positions, an artillery barrage or a dive bomber raid would soon follow. For the soldier on the ground, the Rama was not just a reconnaissance aircraft, but a symbol of inevitable threat, a kind of harbinger of misfortune. Soldiers recalled how Ramas would hang over trenches for hours, as if deliberately emphasizing their presence. They did not hide or leave quickly. On the contrary, they hovered in the sky, searching for the slightest troop movements. On the front lines, the appearance of the FW-189 became commonplace. Morning, afternoon, and even evening, they returned again and again to correct fire and mark targets for subsequent strikes. Their role was particularly difficult in the Battle of Stalingrad. General Fyodor Polinin later recalled that Ramas appeared over the positions near Mamayev Kurgan 5 to 6 times a day, at intervals of only 2 to 3 hours. They seemed to be on duty over this point, transmitting the coordinates of Soviet troops, after which bomber raids or artillery bombardments would begin. For the defenders of the city, these machines became the embodiment of constant pressure and fatigue from endless attacks. At the same time, the Rama crews operated with composure. Confident in their machines' maneuverability and air support, they carried out their tasks methodically, not allowing themselves unnecessary maneuvers. Their presence broke morale. Soldiers felt they were under constant observation, that every step was recorded by the flying eye. It was this combination of technical capabilities and psychological pressure that made the FW-189 one of the most hated aircraft on the Eastern Front. Almost legendary stories circulated among Soviet pilots about the resilience of the FW-189. It seemed that this aircraft could withstand damage that would have caused any other machine to disintegrate in the air. In the recollections of frontline soldiers, there are stories of Ramas returning to base with dozens of bullet holes in their fuselage and wings, having lost an engine, or even after a ramming attack. Pilots and soldiers saw machines that, smoking and losing skin, still held in the air and found the strength to reach the airfield. The secret lay in the combination of design and aerodynamics. The wing loading of the FW-189 was relatively low, allowing the aircraft to maintain controllability even with serious damage. The 2 engines offered a chance to return home on at least one, and the lightness and stability of the design helped pilots control the machine where it seemed there was no way out. For Soviet fighters, an encounter with a Rama became a real test. Standard attacks rarely yielded quick results. The recommendations of Soviet specialists were very specific. Attacks should be made from a dive at an angle of 30-45 degrees or from below, where the enemy was particularly vulnerable. The front hemisphere was considered a real weakness, where armor protection was almost non-existent, and the incapacitation of the pilot or navigator could take the entire machine out of action. However, carrying out such attacks was extremely difficult. The Focke-Wulf's maneuverability allowed it to sharply veer into turns, descend in a spiral, and switch to hedge-hopping flight, where it became a difficult target against the background of the ground. General Boris Yermin recalled that to inflict reliable damage, one had to aim at the cockpit itself, or even at the tail booms, but hitting them was incredibly difficult. It sometimes seemed that to shoot down a Rama, it literally had to be cut in half. It was this resilience that made the Focke-Wulf a special opponent. Shooting it down was not just a military task, but a kind of challenge for every pilot. Those who achieved such a victory knew they had destroyed not just a reconnaissance aircraft, but one of the most durable and cleverly designed machines of the war. In addition to the series-produced reconnaissance aircraft, designers had many ideas on how else to utilize the successful Focke-Wulf design. Over the years, rare versions appeared, each representing an attempt to expand the Rama's capabilities. One of the first such directions was a training variant. Several A3 series machines were equipped with dual controls to train crews. The cockpit was adapted for instructors and cadets, and the design itself remained largely unchanged. These aircraft proved quite suitable for training, but did not gain widespread use as primary production was focused on combat machines. A bolder experiment was the Focke-Wulf, an armored assault aircraft. Its gondola was made cramped with massive armor protection. It barely accommodated a pilot and a rear-facing gunner. The idea was to turn the Scout into a direct ground support aircraft, but tests showed that the pilot's visibility sharply decreased, handling dropped, and firepower remained insufficient for this role. As a result, the project was deemed a dead end. Another interesting experience was the Focke-Wulf seaplane. Designers replaced the landing gear with 2 floats, expecting such a machine to conduct reconnaissance over the sea and land on water. However, tests showed that the heavy design did not combine well with the floats, and the sea required different solutions, and this project remained a single prototype. There were other ideas, multi-purpose variants, staff versions, even attempts to create a modification with new cannons. But almost all of them came down to one thing. The basic concept of the Rama worked perfectly as a reconnaissance aircraft, and in all other roles, the machine lost its key advantages. Therefore, most of these experimental variants remained on paper or as single prototypes, leaving the Focke-Wulf with a single but very solid role, the flying eye of the front. By the summer of 1943, the Focke-Wulf had become a regular participant in combat operations, and the Luftwaffe Command decided to deploy it in large-scale operations. One of the key tests for the Rama was Operation Citadel, the grandiose offensive near Kursk. It was here that the reconnaissance aircraft fully demonstrated their capabilities. They patrolled for hours over the front lines, recorded the movement of Soviet units, transmitted coordinates to artillery, and corrected dive bomber strikes. Their work allowed German troops to deliver precise strikes on fortifications, but at the same time made the Ramas themselves one of the most coveted targets for Soviet pilots. Before the Battle of Kursk, the command even tried to use the Focke-Wulf in a new role for combating partisans. In the rear of Army Group Center, such aircraft were used in punitive operations. They patrolled forests, searched for resistance camps, and transmitted data for subsequent attacks. The German leadership appreciated their effectiveness, as the view from board allowed them to spot even camouflaged encampments. But this experience was short-lived. Within a few weeks, the machines were returned to the front, where the need for them was far greater. During Citadel, the Ramas became a symbol of the Luftwaffe's persistence. Despite strong resistance from Soviet fighters and dense ground fire, they continued to perform their missions. Their presence over the battlefield was constantly felt, and this irritated the Red Army soldiers, who called the Ramas persistent and unavoidable. Every sortie was accompanied by risk, but the crews understood that the accuracy of strikes and the success of ground units depended on their work. Thus, the FW-19 became an integral part of major operations. Even when attempts were made to use it in other roles, the war invariably returned the Rama to its main task: to be the eyes of the army, to observe, mark, and direct strikes where they were most needed. Although the Eastern Front remained the primary theater for the FW-189, the fate of these machines was not limited to the vastness of the USSR. The Germans tried to expand the Rama's use in other regions, and each new direction revealed unusual chapters of its history. In North Africa, several machines were equipped with dust filters and sent to the desert. There, they were used for reconnaissance and observation of British and American troop movements. Despite the harsh climate, the Rama proved to be quite resilient. It could hover for hours over the sandy expanses, recording column movements and correcting strikes, although the heat and dust quickly wore down the equipment. Another area of experimentation was the conversion of the FW-189 into a night interceptor. About 30 machines were converted. They were equipped with FUG-212 radar, with characteristic antennas in the nose. Instead of reconnaissance equipment, additional MG-151 cannons and machine guns were installed. These versions became part of special night fighter squadrons. However, in actual combat, the Ramas showed limited effectiveness. Their insufficient speed and weak armament did not allow them to compete with full-fledged night fighters. Some aircraft were converted into staff transport planes for carrying officers and for communication between units. Their spacious cabin and convenient crew arrangement allowed the aircraft to be adapted for such tasks without significant structural changes. Thus, the FW-19 tried its hand far beyond the Eastern Front, from the hot deserts of Africa to the night skies of Europe. But in whatever role it was used, reconnaissance remained its strongest suit. And even if new tasks were not always successful, the very idea of multi-purpose use of the Rama highlighted its versatility and value to the Luftwaffe. Constant operation on the fronts showed that even such a successful aircraft as the FU-189 needed further development. Designers sought to give it more power and protect the crew from growing threats. Thus, new projects were born, which, although they did not become mass-produced, showed how seriously the Germans tried to improve their flying eye. One of the first such directions was the FW-189 built in France at the SNKO plant. Instead of the standard Argus engines, French GR-14M radial engines, producing about 700 horsepower, were installed. It seemed this should have significantly improved the aircraft's performance, but in practice, the gain was limited. The more powerful engines added weight, altered the machine's balance, and the advantages for which the Rama was famous, ease of control and stability, began to be lost. Then came the modifications of the F-series. The most famous was the FA2 version with 600 horsepower AS401 engines. These engines were more reliable and provided better performance at altitude. In addition, engineers strengthened the cockpit armor and improved its protection against frontal attacks. Later, a small number of A4 versions were produced, where the main focus was on firepower. They were equipped with Mk101 cannons in the wings instead of MG17 machine guns. Such armament allowed the Rama not only to defend itself, but also to more effectively attack ground targets. However, all these improvements did not change the main thing. The FW-19 remained primarily a reconnaissance aircraft. Even with reinforced armor and cannons, it could not compete with full-fledged attack aircraft or fighters. Its value lay elsewhere, in its ability to observe and survive where other machines failed. Therefore, new versions were produced in limited series, remaining more of a supplement to the main line than a replacement. These searches for new solutions showed that the Rama had significant structural reserves for modernization, but its true strength always lay in its unique concept, panoramic view, and ability to conduct reconnaissance even in the most difficult conditions of war. By 1944, the fate of the FW-189 was sealed. The war demanded more and more resources, and the Luftwaffe's priorities shifted towards fighters capable of countering mass Allied air raids. Factories were overloaded with the production of FW-190s and Messerschmitts, and there was less and less room for the Rama in their plans. The last batches were produced in France and Czechoslovakia, but the numbers were no longer in the hundreds, but in the tens. The aircraft, created as a specialized reconnaissance aircraft, did not become the most mass-produced, but its influence on the war was enormous. It became the eyes of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, an indispensable companion to artillery and infantry. For Soviet soldiers, the Rama was remembered as a persistent silhouette in the sky, a harbinger of new attacks, a machine that was hated and feared, but at the same time respected for its resilience. For pilots, it was an opponent that was not easy to defeat, and victory over it was considered a special achievement. By the end of the war, the FW-189 could no longer meet the new realities. Even with modernizations, it remained slow and vulnerable compared to newer aircraft. But despite this, the memory of it was preserved in memoirs and accounts of combat participants. It became a symbol of an entire era, an example of how a relatively small-numbered aircraft could leave a deep mark on the history of the war. The Rama entered images and memories, becoming an integral part of frontline folklore. For some, it was an intrusive enemy; for others, a reliable assistant in carrying out combat missions. And it was in this contradiction that its legacy lay. Not the most powerful and not the most numerous aircraft, but one of the most memorable from the years of the Great War.